Are you curious about Gestalt language processing? You are not alone. Join me, Corinne Smoose, and Speech Therapy PD for our podcast, The Gestalt Get Together. Our episodes try to balance the enthusiasm and excitement about GLP and its associated intervention ideas, as well as a healthy dose of skepticism about how to understand and integrate this paradigm shift into your career and the field at large. We hope that you can get together with us to learn more about Gestalts.
Welcome to Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, a podcast presented by Speech Therapy PD. Brainstorms is designed for adult medical speech-language pathologists working across practice settings and across the lifespan. I hope that this podcast brings you evidence-based practice that's easily digestible and applicable to your everyday practice. Enjoy. The content of this course is based on the research and experience of the presenters. The listener is responsible for researching to determine if the information and skills taught are appropriate for their clients, students, or patients. SpeechTherapyPD.com does not necessarily endorse, recommend, or favor the information shared, nor any of the claims, opinions, statements, offers, or services made by the presenter. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Renee Garrett, and I'm your Speech Therapy PD podcast host for Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Before we get started, we have a few items to alert you to. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for 0.1 ASHA CEU. Here are the financial and non-financial disclosures. Anna Ware receives an honorarium for her appearance on this podcast from Speech Therapy PD. She has no relevant non-financial relationships to disclose. My financial disclosures are I am a paid employee of a private consulting firm in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and as the host of Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, and other webinars on Speech Therapy PD, I do receive financial reimbursement. I also am an adjunct instructor for both James Madison University and Old Dominion University. My non-financial disclosure is that I'm the secretary for the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia. Questions can be written in the chat box or the Q&A and will be answered throughout the presentation. Now, without further ado, we welcome our guest, Anna Ware, MS CCC-SLP. Anna has been a clinical practicing SLP for 15 years. She has grown her expertise and passion working with all ages within the Augmentative Alternative Communication Specialty, AAC, while working at both Shirley Ryan Ability Lab and Shriners Hospital in Chicago. She has taught professional level CE and graduate level courses on AAC. She hopes to make AAC knowledge more widespread and available to clinicians in all settings. She feels no person should be left without a voice or the opportunity to learn and obtain communication. She's advocated at the state level with funding processes to ensure funding availability for all clients when it comes to higher technology resources. She also advocates finding and implementing all the free and paper-based resources so every clinician can incorporate AAC in any setting. She's learned that a big part of her advocacy is ensuring her own cultural humility and responsibility in the field, especially being part of the team that facilitates developing a means to communicate with someone. She's recently started her own practice as well in the Chicago area, entitled AAC Aware PLLC. You can follow her on Instagram at AAC Aware. She earned her undergraduate Bachelor of Science degree from Western Michigan University and her Master of Science in Speech Language Pathology at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. She's lived in Chicago since graduation and has fallen in love with the city, now raising her family here, which includes her 2 young sons and spouse. Thank you so much, Anna, for agreeing to be on the podcast and share your vast knowledge. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you. That all sounds so impressive. Person.
Yeah, sometimes I feel that way too. When people are like, "Oh, we heard your bio," and I'm like, "Oh gosh, late. Maybe I should make that shorter."
Yeah, no,
but yours is great, and I think just to kind of, I want to start in a couple of different ways. One is to kind of spark what led me to reaching out to you. And then, so I'll start with that. And then I want to kind of jump in with you and ask you about how you got started with AAC to begin with. So kind of just a background on what sparked the idea for this interest in more of a cultural humility and sensitivity aspect. I mean, I think a lot of us are doing that in our practice anyway, but a couple of things happened this year to me. Well, it was really not to me, it was to my patients, from other professionals that were on the same team as me, that really led me to think about how, we work together a lot as interdisciplinary teammates. And sometimes some of our teammates don't always reach out to speech, which, we're the primary communication specialist. And so it's always astounding when someone makes a choice and they don't reach out for sort of that background or that relevant experience that we may have that could influence the choice that they made. And so just a couple of things specifically that happened was, one therapist that I work with made some visual supports for a client who's completely nonverbal and is pretty severely intellectually abled. And so the icon number and the color pictures matched with words were really not accessible for him. And then within probably a week or two after that, I had another colleague who made some visual supports for a client who is an African American grown man, also primarily, well, he's somewhat verbal. He does have some words and he does do some signs and some gestures. But the bottom line was that the icons on his visual supports were preschool white children. And I was very, like, it just did not sit well with me. And I was very upset about the whole thing and trying to figure out how to approach it in a way that wasn't, I don't want to say combative, that's not the right word, but it wasn't confrontational with the teammate, because I wanted them to be aware of what it looked like to me and then to all the other potential. And no one complained about it. It was just my perception and assuming what the other people in the room who were of the same race that these two African American grown up males were, and how that could possibly be perceived and how that would impact our ability to work further with that client. So that's sort of where this whole thing got sparked really for me. But thinking about just how you got started in AAC, I think is a really interesting place, because it's not something that everyone chooses to specialize in. I think a lot of us dabble in it really because we have aphasia clients or we have patients with other neurological communication disorders that maybe we have a necessity to some, I would say moderate skill set. I wouldn't say advanced necessarily, but if you could just kind of walk us through what led you to this path.
I know, it's a good question. So I was fortunate in graduate school that we did have an AAC course, and it was more pediatric focused, where we went to a school in New Jersey that was for children with cerebral palsy, and the SLPs that worked at that school taught us. And this was before the iPad or anything that was really portable, but we really got to get our hands and eyes on different type of equipment. And I have to admit, I even at the time was like, I'm going to be a medical SLP. I'm going to work in the hospital setting and do dysphagia. And I did a placement at a school for my internship during graduate school. And I really liked it. And I really fell in love with the variety of population. And so being able to do that, I'm sorry, I'm being interrupted by a 5-year-old.
Yeah, and just to kind of fill in, we actually had an AAC course in undergrad, which was back then was kind of unheard of from what I understand, but that was sort of where we got our basics for some of the things we're going to talk about tonight, and just how a lot of schools back, 10, 15 years ago didn't have AAC courses, but mine was taught by an AT specialist from the public school system. So
yeah, sorry about that. My 5-year-old's looking for a certain crayon, but priorities.
Real life.
Yes, but so I fell in love with it during this internship, and And then I was still trying to figure out where I wanted to go. And I ended up in Chicago. And the job I got was working at a skilled nursing facility in the Bronzeville neighborhood, which is a historically Black neighborhood. And I grew up in West Michigan. And when we visited Chicago, it was more like you go downtown, you see all the sights. And when I took this job at this skilled nursing facility, it's this rich, vibrant community of dominantly Black African Americans, then learning about the Great Migration of a lot of these, how they've moved up with their families. And many of them would identify and say, like, oh, I'm from Missouri or I'm from Mississippi, even if they had been there for 80 years in the Chicago Bronzeville neighborhood. So I quickly learned so much cultural, and I should also identify as this is a podcast. I'm a white female Christian heterosexual, so I fit very much the population of a speech pathologist, native English speaker. And growing up in West Michigan, that was a much more conservative area. So, and I was seeking out more diversity and more bigger city life. And then working in this skilled nursing facility, I made such great, wonderful relationships and got to know so many people. And then I started doing more dysphagia and the COG-COM, and then really getting into that skilled nursing facility where you had the high expectations of productivity. And then after 2.5 years, I was looking to get more of a variety in my skill set and get into that. And the job I was able to get was because of this AAC experience, was a part-time job at Shriners Hospital here in Chicago. And again, it's a hospital that services people no matter what your insurance is. Like in 2012, they were just starting to bill insurance. So it was so different from the contrast of working in a nursing home and, trying to meet those minutes and for the reimbursement from Medicare. But so getting into Shriners Hospital part-time, but everything had changed in even those 2.5 years because the iPad came out, software is always changing. And then I wasn't the one doing the evaluations on my own when I was at my internship. And here I was by myself. And then during that time, also a part-time position opened up at the time it's the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. It's now the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, as they have opened up a bigger hospital with the namesake of Shirley Ryan. And in that setting, I was working with all different populations, and specifically there's a technology center that specialize in all AAC across the lifespan. And I got to work there and be mentored under occupational therapists that have been doing it for 30, 40 years, collaborating with them with speech pathologists that had specialized in this. And then that really enriched my experience. And I also feel like doing traditional speech therapy, I always felt stymied on what can I do? Like, they're not going to be able to talk tomorrow, but they have things they need to say today. We're seeing behaviors that are because they can't communicate. And I love AAC in the sense of that it's strength-based. Like, I'm seeing what you are doing. I see that you are trying. And I think also as part of my life journey, looking at that, I realized I am a woman with ADHD that I was a high achiever and never really realized why things were hard for me until my one son got diagnosed just recently, a year ago. And all of that makes sense of like, why was I seeking for this validation of like strength based? I see you're working. I recognize this. What can we do to meet you where you're at? And still set these expectations of like, you can continue to grow and develop. Or even working with the ALS population and working with the stroke and aphasia population and the traumatic brain injury population, all these acute changes for adults that knew a life where they were completely independent. And now I can't. And it's so frustrating and limiting, and being able to be just that resource of information. Like, I'm not going in there fixing anything. There's no magic wand, but to provide options outside of the box of those traditional, okay, if you read these sentences out loud 50 times and you start to get more automatic speech and you have these word finding strategies where like, let's like for aphasia, let's make a communication book with these high meaning interests. We pull in real photos and we take your vocab inventory and we train your caregiver to help support, that supported communication. We can now reduce that frustration. And even with apraxia, now we're saying things spontaneously, or we're reading these things and feeling empowered to continue on this journey that nobody signed up for. I mean, I'm often like, you didn't sign up for this. It's right on Lake Michigan and Shirley Ryan. They have this beautiful view. I'm like, well, you didn't sign up for this $1 million view. And we're having to drag you to therapy every day because of this unfortunate stroke or traumatic brain injury. So I feel like, and then I was in that role at Shirley Ryan for at least the last 12 years. And then because we live in Chicago, the traffic and the commute and life sciences with kids in school, I still work their registry, but it's been a beautiful experience. And then I've gone back. I had left Shriners for a little bit, and now I'm back there getting to build even more of the skill set that I'd fine-tuned and getting to serve a population of children that have complex medical needs that, how are we going to help support communication? Because everybody has something to say, and like, how are we seeing you and hearing you and recognizing that? So I find a lot of value and importance, and it all ties into that being culturally humble, because I'm listening to you. Who am I to say like, this is what you're saying, and recognizing it? So there is so much intersection and intersectionality with it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because my first job was inpatient rehab, and we were also on the Bay, and we served just a wide variety of, anybody with TBI, stroke. We had Parkinson's patients, ALS patients, spinal cord injury patients. We had an LTAC floor, and we had this beautiful view that our patients would like run down the hall as best they could in their wheelchair to get to the end where the table was that looked over the bay so they could watch the dolphins while they eat. So I totally understand.
Yeah.
No one wanted to have that view, but at the same time, like, we're so thankful that they had that view, right?
Right.
And I think, looking at that AAC, because I think one of the things that a lot of professionals outside of, SLPs too, but outside of like SLPs, they hear AAC and they jump immediately to these complex devices that are the really high tech. And that's not always what AAC looks like. So I'm so glad you brought up meaningful vocabulary and communication books, and, even something as simple as visual schedules. If it's just as simple as a black and white line drawing versus this beautiful real picture, or like I have some patients that want, there's a lot of high priority placed on eating because I'm in Virginia, and everything is like, from Virginia down in the South, everything is on eating and like social eating, family eating, going out to restaurants that are familiar. And so a lot of the clients that I serve want pictures and logos of the places that they enjoy so that they can either point to them or it triggers them to come up with some word that means something to them, whether it's the name of the restaurant or the name of the food that they get there. And I think that's a really, being again culturally sensitive and responsive to what their needs are, because their needs may not look like what our needs look like. And I think you kind of started to touch on that cultural humility piece and what that specifically has to do with AAC. But is that something you can kind of talk about for a minute?
Yeah, I feel like that's, as an adult and a human and a white woman, and then I have two boys. My oldest was a white, and they're white boys. And my oldest was born in 2016 during an election time that I had all of a sudden like, wow, is there room for more white, what am I adding to society? Who am I? And being in Chicago, I'm in a bubble, and I can share like, it's a bubble of like more open-mindedness and liberalness in the sense of politics. And then the politics did not turn that way nationally. And I feel like as I look around, I realize I hadn't always had that opportunity to fully understand what my role was as that person. And I started doing a lot of anti-racism training and reading, and like we have a church nearby that I really got part of the anti-racism team and part of our community events. And then all of that tied directly to the work I did, as in Chicago at Shirley Ryan, we would take almost all insurances. When I worked in the pediatric floor, We were the only place that was taking children that were on trachs and vents, or vents, I should say, for rehab, and any child that was shot that would likely need to be on high supports that needed rehab, we would be servicing, and just seeing like what is my role and making sure that we're meeting that need. And also when we're making communication books, when I started to do more of the training as staff turnover, we would make a lot of communication books for people with aphasia and TBI. It's part of our role. We go in, we do an assessment, like how many pictures can you do? Do you need real photos? Do you need just words? And part of creating those books is making sure that it represents them. And when you Google in brushing teeth, you get a white man or a white woman brushing their teeth, but my client might be Asian American, or they might be Asian Indian, or Black. Like our population that we serve was far more diverse than the speech pathologists that are employed there. And making sure that we're typing in Black man brushing teeth, and that we're getting that Google image and copying it into the board maker template we have, and making sure that those images represent that person, because realizing how embarrassing it is when you're entering into their personal space, their vocabulary, their dynamic, and here we're presenting something that's not representative of who they are, or even the language and the vocabulary inventories are so important, because the food we put on there, the type of activities, the grooming is completely different needs for hair textures and sleeping bonnets, thinking of those type of things that as a white person, I'm not aware of if I'm not taking that time to learn and consider the other side, or even having that room to have those type of conversations, that is a safe space, that if it's presented wrong, that conversation can spark and can be as a learning opportunity, and opening the door of like, I would love to know more about this. Tell me more. Tell me more, and using that ethnographic style interview, and like, tell me more about what is a typical morning grooming routine, or going to bed. What does that look like for you specifically? And making sure that we're incorporating that into their care. They might be wanting to share that with the PCT and the nurse while they're an inpatient and a caregiver. So, and then in 2020, when everybody knows, when all of a sudden anti-racism was like the hot topic and everybody was posting the black squares, I was like, oh, okay, we're getting into discussions. And the Buckeye SLP, Kara, she had started a petition with ASHA, which was a lot of things we've been having discussions on in our group of like, the AAC devices, they're all white, robotic sounding. The intonations aren't appropriate. The images are impossible to change if you're not doing it one by one to make them PCS symbols default, which are the Tobii Dynavox board maker symbols defaulted to white cartoons, which is probably what you were talking about. And we really had to it was just shocking how much time you had to invest to really make this culturally appropriate. And nobody has time to sit there and do it, but we were doing it and teaching family members and apologizing, like, this is what we have. Kara had started a petition and working on the voices and just recognizing the need for this. And then it got a lot of movement, thankfully. And I think now we have the AI technology's changed quite a bit for voicing, but now we have voices that, I think her name is Tamira, or on the voice is like, I'm the first African American voice from acapella. And we had, we got to be part of the beta testing. I'm like, does this sound like so? And, how would you identify this voice? So I feel like the last 4 years, there's been a lot of churning, because now on the high tech, you can now, change, you can do the skin tone options now more readily.
Yeah.
The device companies really saw like, yeah, we are so behind the times. We need to step it up. And there's organizations like Lesson Picks that really made it easier to do the low tech options and variety different. And it still defaults white for most things, but I do think the conversations are happening more. I don't know if it's just people are bringing me the conversations and I hear them because I'm asking them. Right? I'm just
No, I mean, I think, I don't know, because I think that even as a student, and I was an undergrad, like I said, when we had our AAC course, so the university that I went to is in Norfolk, Virginia, which is very much a port and navy town and very diverse. And so I think maybe that was the reason why the instructor taught it that way, was because she was from the Norfolk Public Schools. She was the AT professional. So her, even though she was a white female, her perspective was probably quite different. And she actually taught us how to do some of the things that you mentioned. Particularly, you could change the skin tone in Boardmaker. It wasn't an easy task, because you were
Mhm.
talking like, this was like, I don't know, 2007 or 8. But now it's a lot easier. It's the drawings are still a little funky in Boardmaker sometimes,
Mhm.
but the bottom line is, like you mentioned, the voice was one of the big things, because we have these voices now where it's like a young kid, an older person, a middle-aged person. The accents are pretty good. They have Jamaican, they have Australian, New Zealand. I mean, they have all kinds of British. And I've had some patients who got like the biggest kick out of like going through the voices and being like, well, this doesn't sound like me, but this is hilarious. Or their like spouse will think it's funny, so they'll pick like this voice that is not representative of them, because they find it's almost like it lessens the load for them. They
Mm.
find humor in it, so then they can pick this voice that's not really representative, but it also brings them joy, which is still a really good place to be. But yeah, I think a lot of that is just having that experience that changes your mindset a little bit, makes you a little bit more aware of why so many things were sort of brushed under the rug when it came to, like you mentioned, 2020. A lot of those things were happening for, hundreds of years prior to it being really forefront in the media. And when it became more forefront in the media, I think it sparked a lot of people to make different choices, or maybe make the same choices and then find themselves in a predicament where it maybe wasn't a safe space for them, because they weren't helping their patients and they weren't empowering their communities. And that kind of brings me back to the actionable items where you talked about, to empowering yourself by taking some courses, or pairing with a church that was a congregation that didn't look like you. And that's something I've talked about a lot on the podcast. Is a lot of community education in my local area happens at a lot of African American churches, where they do free education after their church service is over, or maybe on a Saturday they get people from their congregation, or maybe local people in the community that they've had experience with, to come and do this training and teaching on preventable health conditions, but also things like AAC and accessibility to that and what that looks like. So what are some other actionable things that you feel like you've done as far as your practice to promote change and awareness, because there's such a broad cultural need?
Yeah, and one thing about the voices, I think I just overlooked to say, even the bilingual voices. So if you are bilingual and when you speak English, you don't sound like a native English speaker necessarily. You probably have an accent. So they've even created voices that your Spanish voice matches your English voice now. So you can go between the two languages. So even thinking of that. And it's interesting. So, like your question about training. So, and I think why it's important for us as two white women in this field, or even within the white women field, or just discussion, a lot of the education and training falls on the shoulders of non-white people, typically Black women
Mhm.
that are educating. And this becomes the forefront of what they're doing. And it's on us to be learning and having these discussions within our own race and culture and saying, like, we need. I feel comfortable calling out other white colleagues, or even just having these
Yeah.
conversations like, did you think about it this way, or what did they think, going back to that ethnographic style of conversations, so it's not confrontational, but we need to be pausing and thinking and having these conversations, because I used to feel like this is such a bigger cause. Like, I'm not I'm not skilled to know enough about this. I'm just a white person. But also, there are people not having these conversations and not doing this learning and spreading it down, that we need to be thinking of this and hearing it from others from within. And then even for the accountability is like, I'm making relationships with people that I know that may not have the exact same background or the same skin tone as me, and that they feel they can have these conversations with me and I want them to hold me accountable because I am going to make mistakes. Like, this is a journey. I am a human. I'm going to make mistakes. I want to learn. I will be asking questions, but I will be saying things, and I'll probably say things on this podcast. I'll be like, oh my gosh, why did I go there? Or I misspoke. But that's part of human. And I feel like so many of us are afraid of these conversations that have conflict and have big feels. But we are working with patients and clients. They're like the big feels, they are in it. Like, they are
Right.
likely in the hospital. Like, this is a life altering moment. So making sure that I continue to invest myself with relationships that aren't just confirming my biases or knowing that I'm learning different ways. I have made, at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, we started this culturally diverse inclusion anti-racism team within the speech pathology that was led by one of my dear friends who's a Black woman speech pathologist, Dr. Treasure Williams Wood.
Love her.
Yeah. And I mean, we've got stories in the discussions, and ironically, we went to undergrad together, but we weren't there at the same time, but just two parallel stories that are vastly different on the way we got to where we were. And then even like when 2020 happened and we weren't getting messaging from our all white leadership at the hospital, and how are we going to take this on? Because we service we're international. Like, we work with people that come to us from Dubai, that come to us from Egypt. And how are we approaching all of this and learning it and getting support from higher up? And since then, there has been change and dollars that go behind this. That was one thing I've learned through my training. Like, if you're going to have an organization that's going to have the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion supports, like, there has to be a budget if we're going to continue with this, and people need to be, because our jobs are busy, we need to have the support to be able to learn and share the knowledge with that. So yeah, and I feel like just continuing to grow and ask questions and not be afraid to make mistakes, but being empathetic to all of that. I feel like it's ongoing, and knowing, I think there used to be this term cultural competence. Like, there's too many cultures to ever be competent in it all, but I can have a humble lens or humility on, I want to learn, and I love hearing how other families do things and how patients perceive things. So
Yeah, no, I agree. And I remember one of my first, and it was the guy, he was from India, and his family, his children were in the United States and brought him over when he became ill, and he wound up having a stroke, and he was vegetarian, and he was on a pureed diet from the acute care hospital, but his stroke was pretty massive, and he had a lot of not just issues with dysphagia, but his level of awareness and his ability to stay awake. And so there were a lot of reasons that they put him on a pureed diet in acute care, but they kept sending him raw salads, and that was their vegetarian. This was 2010. So this was a vegetarian menu back in 2010 from, for an Indian patient who was on a pureed diet, was raw salads with like chunks of carrots and lettuce and all this stuff, because they didn't really know what to do, for him, and how that played out. And it was funny because the family was like, well, they would do things that were culturally appropriate. Like, they would say, we make these certain dishes and they're very much in line with the pureed texture that was recommended, like certain things with lentils and stuff like that could be easily accommodated. And that's, not on topic with the AAC. It's just a point of being culturally responsive and having that humility to say, yeah, I think that'd be appropriate for him. And he perked up because guess what? He was able to start eating his food that was relevant to him and familiar to him. And again, a lot of cultures center around that social and family eating time together. And so that was very helpful for him and for his family to be able to do that. And I think it speaks again to that accountability of us as white females to see, like, evidence-based practice is one thing when we're looking at it through one lens, but how does that translate over to that cultural humility piece? How are we taking, whether it's low tech or higher tech or even mid tech AAC from an evidence-based standpoint, how do we translate that into things like bilingualism? Because not everything that's bilingual is English and Spanish. Sometimes it's Filipino or Tagalog in English, or another, Chinese or Mandarin.
Are you taking advantage of our new amazing feature? The Certificate Tracker. The free CE Tracker allows you to keep track of all of your CEUs, whether they are earned with us at speechtherapypd.com or through another provider. Simply upload your certificate to your registered account and you're all set. So come join the fastest growing CE provider, speechtherapypd.com.
Well, we work a lot with the Arabic population, and I've worked a lot with the interpreters, and a lot of the times the AAC systems are very much in a formal language, and we have a lot of discussions back and forth with the interpreters and the families, and they're like, we would never say it this way, and what they would say in Egypt versus Dubai, and all the regional aspects, and having those deeper conversations of like, this is not perfect. This is a start to see if this is something we could build on, and how can we go from there. And having those conversations, and I already know how it's going to go and be like, I know this is not how you would say this, but this is the concept. And then we work together on how to personalize this. So, there's a lot of different apps, or even starting off with something as simple as like Go Talk Now, where you build it from scratch and you're importing your own pictures, and you could have a recording of how it's said. Or, there's speech synthesizers that could read the Arabic aloud, but it may not be the right dialect. So those type of things. And I do have to say, you were talking about the diets. I have to say, one of the most, when I worked at the nursing home, I had to work all the holidays, especially being a newbie. So like learning about soul food and being invited to the dinners, like with fried chicken and greens. And I learned so much as being invited to those dinners, and they fed me and were taking care of me because the families would be bringing food to the residents. And it's such a good example of how like just getting yourself out of the comfort zone and getting to experience how do other families experience food, and understanding that. And I feel like, yeah, there's so many things I love about it, and especially with like the Arabic culture, like and my friend who's Vietnamese, like if you don't accept and take in the snack or the tea, even in the hospital setting, it's an insult. Like we need to be understanding and gracious of this, and they're wanting, because they're extending so much of themselves to us, and then we're accepting it with the humble part of us saying thank you. Like, thank you for inviting me into your circle and your family, and how do we represent that? And, understanding that is how we support communication too. And what language are we thinking about to include on our high tech and even our phrases and sentences with that. So
yeah, and it's funny because I think the translators that we use at the hospital and the outpatient settings for health systems are typically computer based. It's a version of an iPad that we call in and we say we have this patient. And there's certainly been times when I've called in, especially when I was doing modified barium swallow studies, and it was an outpatient who was a one-shot deal, right? They came in for that one visit, and there was a guy that came from Cambodia. And again, he was an older gentleman. He was here visiting his children, had a stroke. And the dialect that he spoke, there was no one on that interpreter service who spoke his dialect. And they tried to get someone, but he's looking at them like, no idea what you're talking about. And so that's a big thing. And then where I grew up, we also had a pretty large population of Greek Americans, and I grew up with kids that were their parents were first generation from Greece. And so it's kind of funny because a lot of people don't have, and I didn't think about it as a kid because I would go to my friend's house and we had like a baklava for after school snacks, and one of my really good friends, it was the first person I ever presented with at a state conference is Greek. And so we actually did an AAC talk back, and I'm trying to remember what year that was. I think it was like 2014 or something like that. But I learned a lot from her at that point because we worked together. She was PRN where I worked, but I learned a lot about the implementation because she was an AT person in the schools as well. And how do we start back then, 10 years ago, to change the narrative at a systemic level, because we weren't in a position to change voices on high-tech devices, but we were in a position to get images that were more representative of people's culture. And I think, again, there's just so many ongoing places, that needs that we need to be filling in, and how we can develop that AAC to promote clients' goals, and then, help our colleagues kind of show up as well.
Yeah. And I think something else to think about, and even when you were talking about, people get into the silly voices, but how ableism plays into this in different cultures, where a lot of people aren't ready or have even thought about what a disability is, let alone living with a disability. And a lot of times so full disclosure, my mother had a stroke about a year ago and has aphasia, and she is in West Michigan, and humor was how we got through a lot of it and still do. And, here I'm coming from Chicago working in this setting, and then I have a speech pathologist there at her acute rehab telling me, or it's in the inpatient rehab telling me, well, AAC doesn't work for people with aphasia because it's such a variety. And I was just kind of like, okay, she doesn't know who I am. I'm trying not to be the know-it-all that has experience. But I was like, well, you still need to meet the family where they're at. And where like my sister and I would be laughing and trying, my mom would have breakdowns. And luckily she wasn't frustrated. She was, able to laugh when like things came out totally wrong because she could understand herself. But I also feel like there was such a component where, I needed them to educate my family what aphasia was, because I'm now the child, and
Yeah.
to meet people where they're at, and made her this beautiful book. I did everything. And then she's like, oh, I don't need it. but then and so it's like, you can have all the perfect pieces in place, but it's just every family dynamic has their own thing. And how do we fit into that? Because it's interesting, because like my mom would listen to any other speech pathologist but me.
Oh, wow, I resemble that remark.
Right. So it's just so funny to be like, okay, how do I get them to get this buy-in without, so it's just been a journey to see the different parts of it.
That's interesting, and I did not know that about you. And so the reason I became an SLP is because my dad had a stroke when I was 25 and had aphasia. So,
Okay.
yeah, kind of funny story.
Yeah.
And then my mother-in-law had Alzheimer's, and so she passed away last year. But yes, I totally relate to I wasn't an SLP when my dad had a stroke, but I was an SLP when my mother-in-law got diagnosed and through her journey. And I certainly was.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what I'm talking about.
Oh no, yeah. I become the child. And even my sister will tell a story. She'll be at home because we have a speech. She's now returned. I had her in Chicago doing therapy, and she's back home now in Michigan, living on her own. But my sister will be there, like overhear the speech therapy session, and like the therapist will recommend something, and my mom will be like, wow, yeah, great idea. Like listening to an audio book to go along with reading a book. And my sister would be like, yeah, I'm pretty sure Anna mentioned something like that. So it's even like it's good that we're all sharing, we have research to back up different modes. And that's a great example of AAC is like audiobooks that are accessible and
Yeah.
free through the library. But, I'm just, I'm an, yeah. So it's been very interesting to be on the other end, even when you feel like you're empathetic. And my grandma had a stroke, but she had a right-sided stroke, so she didn't have aphasia, but had all the impulsivities, the right CVA.
Well, it is interesting because we think, again, I go back to the AAC as far as how a lot of clinicians think of it. And again, this isn't just multidisciplinary like OT, PT, nursing and all that. It's a lot of SLPs get hung up on this. It's kind of a twofold thing. One, that AAC is all high tech, and two, once we introduce AAC, that's it. Right?
Right.
They have a hard time understanding that it can be a bridge, much like the way that we explain peg tubes now, that peg tubes don't tend to be a permanent solution towards death. It tends to be a bridge to get patients who need a nutrition source immediately to a place where they can be strong enough to do rehab and dysphagia exercises and get stronger and then get rid of it eventually. Not for every patient, of course, but a lot of patients don't, and the families and even professionals don't think of AAC in that manner. They think of it as a means to an end, not as a means to, okay, this is where we are right now and this is what they need, and then long term they may not need it. And they might, right, depending on the diagnosis.
Yeah, and that's where my ADHD brain went off, but I was talking about the ableism too, where
Mhm.
yeah, you're not sure like, oh, if I need this crutch. But I mean, that's one of the things I bring up almost any age. What, like this same thing as a wheelchair, you're using this now, but you're still working on your walking, depending on your diagnosis, obviously. But majority of people like post stroke and TBI that are working on that. But like, it's okay to be different. It's okay to have this tool. If anything, research shows this will help support your communication, and it's hard to bridge that when and my mom's a very like good example because she's always this independent woman, raised both my sister and I, very strong willed, but like she did allow herself to be vulnerable and try these new things. And I do have to say, like, she didn't carry the book around like a lot of the clients I had, but she made progress and was reading it. And you're like, if she needed a sentence, she'll reference printed words and took these aids to help her. And it's hard. And even with like the ALS diagnosis, like so much of what we're doing to help prepare with voice banking and message banking is a concept that seems so far away when you're early in this diagnosis because you usually might have a little leg weakness or hand weakness if we're getting you early enough. So like, why are we having to, everybody's different on their journey, of course, and then having them understand why we want to message bank and voice bank now as your voice changes, it's going to sound different. And we're our worst critics. There'll be times when I'm like, oh, this sounds great. But they'll hear the dysarthria, they'll hear the changes and not want to use the voice. So even how are we supporting people on those journeys that we might think like you want to do this, but they might not want to. And it's not like you have to do this to have access to AAC. So even recognizing those cultural differences on how you approach a progressive disease.
Mhm. Yeah, I know. I've had a couple of patients like that I did get early on with ALS, and they didn't. It was a lot of education, which is fine because I think that's always going to be a platform for me is education and advocacy for patients, but helping the patient to have that understanding on why it's important, but also being respectful of the fact that the buy-in might not happen immediately, if at all, and having caregivers that are supportive, but a lot of times that, you can provide these educational resources because if people are, and again, that takes into like social determinants of health. Are they able to process this information? What is their health literacy like? Because a lot of that education that's written is not written for people who don't maybe it's not written for people who are even bilingual or multilingual, because a lot of times, even with like assessments, what happens is the material gets translated from English, but it's not necessarily, like you mentioned, translated into their dialect or the verbiage that they would use when they're talking to their family. So there's a lot of different things like that that we have to really educate ourselves on and be mindful of, because it's not a one size fits all. And I think that's the whole point of all of this, is that we have to be mindful that our traditional way of thinking, like, oh, it's so great, now we have these aphasia materials that are bilingual or they're in Spanish, but that doesn't mean that they're culturally appropriate for someone who is from South America and doesn't speak English translated Spanish, because that's basically what it is.
Right.
And I
you
think
see
that's
that. Yeah. I was going to say, and Dr. Gloria Soto out of University of San Francisco, like she's done research with her colleagues about like the core words, like how different that is between native Spanish speakers and native English speakers, and thinking about how we make these core words. Like we need to be incorporating not just a direct translation of what English was, and thinking of the pronouns are different and the different tenses. And that's where that research is so vital, that we know where to start. Like it's proven. And even code switching, when you speak two languages, you could, like now the devices are set, you go from English to Arabic or Spanish, it just translates the whole system. But when you're listening to the family speak, like they're using English and Spanish words within the same sentence. And like, how do we meet the AAC where they're at, and it might be just recording that voice onto the button, because the synthesizers aren't smart enough to switch between the two languages on there. I'm sure that'll be coming, but right now it's, if you leave the English voice synthesizer and you have the Spanish words, you'll sound like me from West Michigan. I keep trying to work on my Spanish, but I'm still very West Michigan nasal.
That's funny. I always tell people I don't even remember how many years in high school, and then I took 5 semesters in college. And we had, it's not there anymore, but we used to have this really nice little Mexican restaurant up the street. And when my son was in college, well, even in high school, he was a lifeguard at a local pool, like not in our neighborhood, but like a neighborhood down the street. And the guy who is the manager at the Mexican restaurant lived in that neighborhood. And so my son is actually not bilingual, but he's pretty good. He can hold a conversation pretty decently. And so it was really funny, because when my son would come home, his kids would get all, the guy that was the manager of the Mexican restaurant, his kids would get all excited because my son would be there and he would at least try to speak to them in Spanish, even if it wasn't always correct. And so I thought that was really cool, that even after my son's been done with college for a number of years now, but whenever he comes home, this guy, if we run into him somewhere, he's like, oh my gosh, he will bring it up even now. And it's been, not 10 years, but pretty close to 10 years ago. But I also remember being like, when I took my ASL classes I think it was when I was an undergrad, like mind blown that there were multiple dialects of ASL. And again, this is just stuff that we just don't know. If we're not in that culture, we just don't know. And I think that's another area that is just interesting, because we do have some patients that use forms of ASL, but still use, like our clients with autism who use modified ASL signs, but may also be reliant on some AAC mid-tech or even high-tech devices as well, that we don't always hit that mark because they can't communicate with us and tell us. And like with the population I'm working with now, a lot of the clients they have like intellectual disabilities, and they don't necessarily have family around who've been with them. They've been placed in homes and moved from foster care or different autism centers throughout their lifespan, and they don't have that familial background to be able to tell us that. And that's another area that it makes it a real challenge for us, but for me, I feel like in the best way possible. So how can we, take those challenges and move forward in
Mhm.
our field? Because that's a big ask.
I know. I just had a really interesting case the last couple weeks at work where I worked with the child who's a teenager and she's a CODA, so a child of deaf parents, also a Black family, and the siblings are deaf except one older sister is hearing as well. But the child I was working with is autistic and has weaknesses, so a form of cerebral palsy, but like she's not able to communicate with the family easily because she can't sign, like she understands, and there hasn't been any supports for them at the school to work on communication. So we were trialing different things on the high-tech device, and I made sure with the interpreter that everything takes longer with the interpreter because you're essentially saying it twice. So I made sure that we had time to be like, I want you to know, like, your language, your culture is deaf. Like, this is your native language. And like, none of this is because her parents want her to be able to communicate to more people and to them. But it's like, how do we find this fine balance of still respecting deaf culture and how we're going to access communication for her too. So looking at core boards, and yeah, it was interesting, and like how to wanted to introduce that sense of, I want to learn, what do you think, where should we go, what do you think works, her best. And then even the
Mhm.
education around like what gestalt language processing is, and like they're like, she is repetitive a lot with what she does sign, so how that carries over even to like her modified signs. It was a I was very fortunate to get to know this family and collaborate with them.
Yeah, and I think that the family piece is big, when we have access to it. But it is,
Yeah.
a lot of the adults that I see now, some do have family that have been wonderful caregivers or at least active in their life, but I have a lot that are not, and it's been really interesting to see some of the evolution of these patients when they get with the right support system, whether it's a day support or whether it's their supported living that they're in, and they can either have access to, again, we don't necessarily have to have the high tech AAC, but we have these visual supports, these picture cards, these communication books where they have access to it, and then they have the support staff who are actually doing the work and helping them, and then we go back to do training with them, and they're able to give us as the communication professionals these really important pieces of information that help us help them. And it just, if you don't have that, whether it's a family member or not, and you're not working towards that cultural responsiveness, you're really not doing your due diligence,
Mhm.
right? Because it is challenging work. It's not always easy. We don't always have all the answers, but it's that being willing to look for the answers and being willing to find those resources. Um, whether it's, you mentioned, gosh, now I'm going to lose my train.
My train's always gone.
Well, we were talking about, and I have it pulled up on my computer. So let me look so I don't sound crazy. Because you sent me some resources before.
Yeah, I was gonna say there are some amazing resources to know about, and there's been so much. I mean, I'm learning from people. I'm no expert by any means of the like bilingual population. I would just
Mm,
work a lot with them in the nature, but like bilingual, BILNGUE, SLPs are working on AAC. And we'll post, I know I sent them to you so you can post them, but like
yeah,
Dr. Gloria Soto's
yeah.
website has like a whole thing on like culturally diverse ways to learn more about AAC specifically. And that
Hmm.
website will just take you to so many resources, and taking the time to find this value into the self-learning. And even when I'm working on a bigger team, like I'm bringing this information to my team, we're having these discussions, we're doing, ASHA's got forms online of like, how do I see what cultural responsiveness is, and like self-grading ourselves, or even doing the Harvard bias test we did as a team
Yes.
and
Hmm.
discussing those, and just having those discussions within, and And our experiences continue to change. The
Yeah.
way I talk or answer a question, even like last week, could be different than this week versus, 10, 15 years ago. And that's the glory of getting older and, more experiences.
Yeah, seasoned. We call that
Yeah,
seasoned.
like it's such a gift. Like there's so many, time is a gift and learning is a gift. And, if we don't continue to evolve, yeah, I don't know. I feel like that's sad.
Well, and I think one of the other studies was Dr. Soto and early Spanish vocabulary for children who use AAC. That was the other thing that you sent over. So we'll post those in the show notes on the website. But again, I think our learned experiences have a vast impact. And a lot of that comes from the experience that we have with our patients and being willing to have that shared decision-making process with not only the patient, but their caregivers, if we're so fortunate to have them. I can remember having students before that were like, oh no, the family's in the room, or oh gosh, their sister's here. And people get intimidated by that. But I always try to explain it that, and even acknowledging it to the family, that I'm grateful that they're there because I just met their family or loved one, and you have all this lifetime of experience. And so explaining it to our students that way and our CFs that way, that don't be intimidated by it, but make it a learning experience for you and for the family, and just acknowledge that you're grateful that they're there, and what can they tell you about the way that this patient communicated previously versus what their communication style is now. Because for those patients that have aphasia or have a TBI and a cognitive communication disorder, it can be life-changing for them, and it can be really therapy changing for us to know what steps to take to get them back as close to, or hopefully something resembling how they communicated before. And we won't have access to that or know that unless we have someone who knew them before that can communicate that information.
Absolutely. I know it's such a gift because even you said that, I was like, there's a lot of people that work in schools that don't have access to the family and get that information. And you're going in trying to be as thoughtful as you can, but it's hard when you have limited information, or even if the sensory systems are so different at school versus at home and how somebody acts, it's hard to meet them where they're at or support them too.
Yeah, and I think that's true across really anyone, because like you mentioned with ADHD, and then like my father-in-law was here today and we were talking about just different styles of the way people keep their house, and the orderliness or like cleanliness, and just routines of putting things where they go. And so it sounds like the craziest thing ever, but it does speak to someone's abilities, what they're good at. And that's our job, is to figure out not necessarily what are your deficits, what are you really bad at, but what were you good at before, what are you still good at now, and how can we capitalize on those strengths to supplement these areas that are a little bit more of a challenge. And that's, as I've gotten more experience, that's the way I try to explain it to people now, because I find that it's less, it gives them a sense of power in a way, and it gives them a sense of, okay, you're not here to just quiz me. We're not going to take a test every day.
Well, but everybody gets tested. Yeah, so you get quizzed and tested and drilled, and let's bring back autonomy and how to make these choices and get some meaningful connection. And then they're going to be like, okay, I buy into this. Show me what you got.
There you go.
I always say you have something to say today, and we need to get that across.
Well, thank you, Anna, so much for joining us. I just appreciate you being so willing to be on and to share your knowledge. And again, this is sometimes a kind of a touchy situation, touchy subject for some people. They don't want to acknowledge the fact that, we do have a large majority of white SLPs who are female, who maybe can be off-putting sometimes to people that don't look like us, don't act like us, don't have the same backgrounds. And then also on the flip side of that, some of us as white females don't have the same backgrounds as some of our colleagues of color in other cultures as well. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. So thank you for being so willing to share that experience.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for, I was saying, oh, I didn't have this on my bingo card for this year, but it was a fun experience and went fast. And I look forward to hear feedback for others that have ideas and what I said maybe could have been expanded on too.
Well, thank you again. And thanks, Anna. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. We have a special coupon code for our listeners to receive $20 off any annual subscription to Speech Therapy PD. Head over there to get ASHA CEUs for listening to this podcast and all other episodes. The code is Brainstorms20. 20 is the number 20. We appreciate your positive reviews and support and would love you to write a quick review. Also, subscribe. If there's a topic you'd like to see us cover in the future, you can email us or comment in the comments section or message us on social media. Remember to go to Speech Therapy PD to learn more about earning ASHA CEUs for this episode and more.